We found that very large dry planets were sometimes inhabited by populations of insect-like creatures, each of whose swarms of nests was the multiple body of a single mind. These planets were so large that no mobile organism could be bigger than a beetle, no flying organism bigger than an ant. In the intelligent swarms that fulfilled the part of men in these worlds, the microscopic brains of the insect-like units were specialized for microscopic functions within the group, much as the members of an ant's nest are specialized for working, fighting, reproduction, and so on. All were mobile, but each class of the units fulfilled special neurological functions in the life of the whole. In fact, they acted as though they were special types of cells in a nervous system. In these worlds, as in the worlds of the bird clouds, we had to accustom ourselves to the unified awareness of a huge swarm of units. With innumerable hurrying feet we crept along Lilliputian concrete passages. With innumerable manipulatory antennae we took part in obscure industrial or agricultural operations, or in the navigation of toy ships on the canals and lakes of these flat worlds. Through innumerable many-faceted eyes we surveyed the plains of moss-like vegetation, or studied the stars with minute telescopes and spectroscopes. So perfectly organized was the life of the minded swarm that all routine activities of industry and agriculture had become, from the point of view of the swarm's mind, unconscious, like the digestive processes of a human being. The little insectoid units themselves carried on these operations consciously, though without understanding their significance, but the mind of the swarm had lost the power of attending to them. Its concern was almost wholly with such activities as called for unified conscious control, in fact with practical and theoretical invention of all kinds and with physical and mental exploration. At the time of our visit to the most striking of these insectoid worlds, the world population consisted of many great nations of swarms. Each individual swarm had its own nest, its Lilliputian city, an area of about an acre, in which the ground was honeycombed to a depth of 2 feet with chambers and passages. The surrounding district was devoted to the cultivation of the moss-like food plants. As the swarm increased in size, colonies might be founded beyond the range of the physiological radio system of the parent swarm. Thus arose new group individuals, but neither in this race, nor in the race of bird clouds, was there anything corresponding to our successive generations of individual minds. Within the minded group, the insectoid units were ever dying off and giving place to fresh units, but the mind of the group was potentially immortal. The units succeeded one another, the group self persisted. Its memory reached back countless generations of units, fading as it receded, and finally losing itself in that archaic time when the human was emerging from the subhuman. Thus the civilized swarms had vague and fragmentary memories of every historical period. Civilization had turned the old disorderly warrens into carefully planned subterranean cities, had turned the old irrigation channels into a widespread mesh of waterways for the transport of freight from district to district, had introduced mechanical power based on the combustion of vegetable matter, had smelted metals from outcrops and alluvial deposits, had produced the extraordinary tissue of minute, almost microscopic machinery which had so greatly improved the comfort and health of the more advanced regions, had produced also myriads of tiny vehicles corresponding to our tractors, trains, ships, had created class distinctions between those group individuals that remained primarily agricultural, those that were mainly industrial, and those that specialized in intelligent coordination of their country's activities. These last became in time the bureaucratic tyrants of the country. Owing to the great size of the planet and the extreme difficulty of long-distance travel by creatures so small as the insectoid units, civilizations had developed independently in a score of insulated regions, and when at last they came in contact, many of them were already highly industrialized and equipped with the most modern weapons. The reader may easily imagine what happened when races that were in most cases biologically of different species, and anyhow were completely alien in customs, thought, and ideals, suddenly found themselves in contact and conflict. It would be wearisome to describe the insane warfare which ensued. But it is of interest to note that we, the telepathic visitors from regions remote in time and space, could communicate with these warring hosts more easily than one host could communicate with another. And through this power, we were actually able to play an important part in the history of this world. Indeed, it was probably through our mediation that these races were saved from mutual destruction. Taking up positions in key mines on either side of the conflict, we patiently induced in our hosts some insight into the mentality of the enemy. And since each of these races had already passed far beyond the level of sociality known on the earth, since in relation to the life of his own race a swarm mind was capable of true community, the realization of the enemy as being not monstrous but essentially humane was enough to annihilate the will to fight. The key minds on either side, enlightened by divine messengers, heroically preached peace, and though many of them were hastily martyred, their cause triumphed. The races made terms with each other, all save two formidable and culturally rather backward peoples. These we could not persuade, and as they were by now highly specialized for war, they were a very serious menace. They regarded the new spirit of peace as mere weakness on part of the enemy, and they were determined to take advantage of it, and to conquer the rest of that world. But now we witnessed a drama which to terrestrial man must surely seem incredible. It was possible in this world only because of the high degree of mental lucidity which had already been attained within the bounds of each race. The Pacific races had the courage to disarm. In the most spectacular and unmistakable manner, they destroyed their weapons and their munition factories. They took care, too, that these events should be witnessed by enemy swarms that had been taken prisoner. These captives they then freed, bidding them report their experiences to the enemy. In reply, the enemy invaded the nearest of the disarmed countries and set about ruthlessly imposing the military culture upon it by means of propaganda and persecution. But, in spite of mass executions and mass torture, the upshot was not what was expected. For though the tyrant races were not appreciably more developed in sociality than Homo sapiens, the victims were far superior. Repression only strengthened the will for passive resistance. Little by little, the tyranny began to waver. Then suddenly, it collapsed. The invaders withdrew, taking with them the infection of pacifism. In a surprisingly short time, that world became a federation, whose members were distinct species. With sadness, I realized that on the earth, though all civilized beings belong to one and the same biological species, such a happy issue of strife is impossible, simply because the capacity for community in the individual mind is still too weak. I wondered, too, whether the tyrant races of insectoids would have had greater success in imposing their culture on the invaded country if there had been a distinct generation of juvenile malleable swarms for them to educate. When this insectoid world had passed through its crisis, it began to advance so rapidly in social structure and in development of the individual mind that we found increasing difficulty in maintaining contact. At last we lost touch. But later, when we ourselves had advanced, we were to come upon this world again. Of the other insectoid worlds I shall say nothing, for not one of them was destined to play an important part in the history of the galaxy.